Welcome everyone to the second to last session of the day of the virtual summit that everyone needs right now. We are talking about the difference between virtual coaching and virtual managing. And who we have with us today is Chris O'Connor. He is a very, very, very good manager, people manager, coach. But he also doubles as my husband. And we are actually zooming in from the same house, just different rooms. But we are excited to be talking with you guys today. Chris is definitely the expert here. I don't manage people, but I will ask some questions here and there. And with that said, I would love for Chris to introduce himself to you all.
Hey, everybody. As Maggie said, my name is Chris O'Connor. My number one job is being Maggie's husband, but today we'll talk about my second job, which I am head of sales development at Ambition. So Ambition is a sales coaching and gamification software company. So, you know, a lot of the aspects of our software are actually pretty applicable to this conversation as well, but I promise to stay out of the product speak. So really excited to talk today just about this concept of, you know, coaching versus managing, and then how we do this in a remote virtual setting now.
Cool. And I should also say, you guys should be able to utilize the chat function, or I think there's also a Q&A. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to throw those in there. This is more of a casual fireside type of conversation than a PowerPoint. In fact, we don't have a PowerPoint. We're just chatting. So utilize that as you need. All right. So to kick things off, Chris, if you can just maybe walk us through the difference of coaching versus managing. And there might be some folks who might not have even thought about it that way. So let's start there first.
Yeah. So as I was thinking about, preparing for this session, I started thinking about this concept of like manager versus coach. And for me, just a bunch of different, kind of words came to mind. So when I think about a manager, I'm thinking about someone who is always kind of in telling mode, right? It's very much giving direction, giving a plan to employees and having them carry it out. And then kind of on the opposite side of that, I'm thinking about a coach, and that's someone who's a little bit more collaborative, someone who is spending a lot of time listening and understanding and getting to the root cause of problems, being very collaborative, like I said, with their employees. And so those are just like on the head, just some of the top descriptors that I'm thinking about when I think about a manager versus a coach.
Cool. So that's helpful, setting the context. To also set the context, have you been managing and coaching virtually in your career? And if so, give us kind of set the scene. If not, then tell us how long you've been thrown into this.
Yeah, so I've probably been managing people for about a little over 5 years, and not until probably the last 6 months of my most previous role here at Ambition, prior to COVID-19, I did have 2 employees that are remote. So I did have a quick taste of what remote management was like. But obviously, now the entire team is remote. And so I definitely have had a crash course in coaching a remote team in the last, 6 to 8 weeks. A lot of changes have been happening. And so it's really informed, how I coach the team.
Yeah. And then let's dive more into just kind of the tactile stuff. You have a team of different types of people, right? Different personalities, different motivators. So why don't you tell us just how you approach that? How do you get the most out of your team?
Yeah, good question. I think, and this is probably a theme that I will come back to multiple times in this conversation, but it's because I think it's probably the most important thing. So if you take anything away from this session, this is probably the nugget I would suggest. But you really have to make it clear, like have a really clear expectation for each of your employees as to what success looks like in their role. So you can define whether it's success on a daily basis, success on a weekly basis, monthly, like whatever works in your use case. But it has to be like, in order to have that successful coaching environment, they have to know what a win is, what a successful day is. So for my team personally, we track that on a daily basis. So, when they log off their computer at 5:30, whatever it is, like it needs to be very clear to them whether today was a successful day or not. And then that helps them have really a clear understanding of, am I doing good at my job or not?
Yeah.
And then it helps me as the coach to intervene and quickly see, is someone veering off course or not, and then how can I help them?
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you don't have that clear understanding, then it just makes coaching, managing so much more difficult.
Question: what about, so with your role and the company that you work for, the team you manage and coach, they have kind of a very specific set of metrics and KPIs, because at the end of the day, they're SDRs, BDRs trying to get meetings, right? So
That's right.
in a sense, it's fairly simple to track that because you've got numbers. What about the folks who are doing more like creative work, or the folks who are purely on like the account service, customer success teams? Like, what do you think what would you say to those kinds of managers?
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to sit down and talk about what are those contributions, the biggest contributions to the organization. Like, if you sometimes it is tough to more quantify some of those things, but if you can get down to the root level of like, what input will you bring to the table that is going to, bring a positive output for the organization. If it is closely defined as we can get on those things, I think it's important. Just so that, again, we really know how we're doing from a contribution standpoint.
That's helpful. How often are you having one-on-ones with your team?
We regularly have one-on-ones on a weekly basis.
Okay.
And I typically like to do that very early in the week, either Monday or Tuesday, because typically what we're going to do is that the first half is like look back at last week and kind of recap what were highlights and lowlights from last week, and then goal set for this week.
Yeah. And those one-on-ones are 30 minutes, or are they longer for you?
Typically 30 minutes. I think it's really important that an agenda is sent out beforehand, and your employee has a chance to jot down thoughts and responses. And that way, again, they have a chance to think about what they want to talk about, and come to the table with any questions that they might have. It's really the one-on-one is about them. It's not about me coming with all of these plans and thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. That was going to actually be my next comment and question, was the idea of managing up and how it relates to one-on-ones. And I think there's a strong importance in employees or direct reports feeling empowered to manage up in a sense, and have some say, some, maybe not control, but have some sort of voice within those one-on-one settings. Yeah. And because we're talking about virtual stuff, like what do those look like? Was that an easy transition for you guys, going from obviously face-to-face one-on-ones to now virtual? Are you just using Zoom? How is that?
We do everything Zoom, which has been nice. I mean, we still get that appropriate face time. Although I think there's so many interactions that happen throughout the day, typically in an office setting, where someone is saying, "Hey, Chris, like, what's your opinion on this?" Or "Could I get help with that?" Mm-hmm. And not every employee is willing to like say, "Hey, Chris, can you get on a Zoom meeting with me and discuss this small little, question that I have?" Mm-hmm. And so what I've found over the last 6 weeks or so is like there are needs and requests that come up throughout the day that just don't get asked. And so there's things that aren't getting addressed, which obviously worries me as a coach. And so, yeah, so one of the solutions to that, which has been helpful, is I just spin up a couple hours a week, a Zoom meeting, and I'm just calling it office hours. And so it's just a signal to all of my employees that you can pop in at any point within those few hours, ask whatever question you want. I mean, if you wanted to take 45 minutes of my time, that's fine. Or if you have a 2-minute question, that's also fine.
Yeah. I love that. That's such a great tip, honestly, is to have kind of those office hours. Because then you're not necessarily like, in the back of your mind that this is the structured time for doing this, but you don't have to just be worried about people not, voicing concerns. But on the flip side, the thing there is that you have to trust that your employees are going to ask you those questions. So how do you create trust? How do you create trust, especially right now in a virtual setting? And what about the people who have maybe never had a face-to-face interaction with their manager? Maybe they were just hired, or maybe they've always been a remote company. How do you create that trust?
Yeah, I mean, it's built over time, and I think some of it goes back to the first point I made around having clear expectations on, what your contribution looks like. I think when that is there, me as a manager or as a coach, I can kind of rest at ease knowing that, hey, I know that my employee knows how to be successful. Now it's just up to them to do it. So I'm going to trust them to do that. And then we're going to check in regularly. So it allows you not to be a micromanager, which is nice. And I think you had a question around what about folks who aren't having one-on-ones? I think it goes back to your point around trying to manage up and trying to request, hey, could I get some more time for this, or to talk about that? Hopefully managers and coaches in a time like this understand how crucial it is to be present. And if you're not, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for other people, but I can't think of a more important thing at this time for me, but to be present and making sure that my employees feel supported. And that's why I would suggest that if you have one-on-ones on your calendar with your employees, let that be the last meeting that you push. I think so often, those are the meetings that you say, oh, well, something else came up, let's push it to later in the week, or I didn't really have much to talk about this week anyway, let's just punt to next week. Just don't let that become a habit. Because even if you feel like there's not a lot that's going to happen in that meeting, it may be super important for your employee just to have that FaceTime with you.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is really easy for folks to just want to push something that isn't really directed towards maybe output or client facing stuff. And it does become a habit. That's happened to me. It does become a habit if they just keep getting pushed. And that's really not helpful for anybody. And then especially when it comes to trust, I think it definitely has a negative impact on that trust in that relationship between a direct report and a manager and a coach. I'm interested from kind of a psychological perspective. I mean, because I'm biased, but I do think that you're an incredible boss. So how are you, when you have a new team member, or really just in general, how do you figure out what people's motivators are? Are you asking point blank what motivates you, or are there any tips or tools or things that you use to try to kind of get that intel?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like to do is with brand new employees, I love to take them to lunch and just get to know each other outside of work setting. But definitely, when I open up our one-on-one conversations, the first question is, how are you doing? What's going on in your world? Especially now, that's so important because everyone is dealing with a number of different, weird scenarios right now, and kind of a check-in on their well-being is so important before we start talking business. And so getting in a habit of that is important. I think sometimes people think, oh, that's just like a distraction from what's really important. But it is so important to have those check-ins and just understand like what motivates you. I mean, I think a good coach knows that every employee, every player is going to be coached or motivated in a different way. And so you have to really understand that. So I like to just open up my one-on-ones with some kind of question to get them to know them better before we, start talking about, numbers and things like that. I think one of the very first things that I tell employees is that you should know, and I'll preface this by saying, this is a cornerstone of my management style, and only because I feel like I've had a lot of bad bosses before. But one of my founding or principles would be like, you have to understand that I care more about you as an individual than I do about your numbers or contribution to the organization, because especially in a sales environment like I'm in, it's very easy. And sales has a bad rap of saying like, what have you done for me lately? Like, what are your numbers? And that's not motivating to an employee. They want to work for someone who knows they care about them and stuff like that. So that's another part of it.
Yeah. I love that. That's rare. I feel like for people to, as coaches, as managers, to open up like that and say, I care about you as an individual. Obviously I care about you being successful in this job, but I do care about you as an individual. I think it takes a little bit of extra vulnerability to be able to do that. But I don't think it's ever been poorly received when people are showing, kind of that genuineness. I don't think that there's ever been a situation where it's like, I didn't like that person asking me that or telling me that,
Yeah. And it just sets a good foundation for, even if you have to have really tough conversations with an employee.
Yeah.
They know that you're coming from a place of, hey, I want to get this right because I care about you as a person. I'm not here just to reprimand you because I don't like what your contributions are.
I'm curious, going virtual, what are those more difficult conversations looking like? Are you finding them to be more challenging for you because it's virtual, it's not face-to-face? Do you feel like it actually maybe is a little bit easier because it's not face-to-face? Like, tell me about that transition, because honestly, difficult conversations are going to happen. So tell me more.
I think what's been most difficult is getting a true pulse of like what somebody's thinking or feeling. Because I think more so in a remote environment, engagement levels can vary, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know what's going on in everybody's situation. Some people may have a lot of stuff going on at home that's kind of dragging them down and keeping them away from work or being engaged at work. And so getting a pulse on engagement levels has been difficult. Whereas when you're in the office, like you can see them all the time, have a better understanding of body language, how people are feeling about things. So I think that's been the most difficult thing. And then with that is checking in with each rep and making sure, like having a little bit more deeper questions about how are you feeling? Like what is your engagement level right now? I'm sensing this, but I could be way off. Yeah. Tell me more about how you're feeling.
I love that. I think that's especially great for folks if they are maybe at a company and they don't have like company-wide engagement surveys or pulse checkers. I think, at the end of the day, that your job is to, if we're talking black and white scenarios, your job is to get the most out of your team, right? But you do that through a very human, genuine approach. So having those check-ins, not even just during your one-on-ones, I think is probably really helpful for folks. Question about just the kind of the tactile stuff. I'm curious to know for you, this could be helpful for other people. How long does it typically take for you to kind of create that trusting relationship with an employee? And I know things might be a little bit different now virtually. Maybe you could speak to that because you do have a couple new folks on your team. So what does that actually look like? At what point should someone say, something is not clicking, we really need to have a sit down? Or, how much time does that take? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's hard to give a good answer to that.
Yeah. I know everyone's different, right? Some people are easier to open up than others,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. If you're having, consistent conversations in your one-on-ones on a weekly basis, for your newer employees, you should be checking in more than once a week. You should, build a pretty good rapport and have a really good understanding of, motivations and expectations pretty early on, within a month and a half. Our typical onboarding period for our new employees, like we look at it as like kind of a 3-month chunk.
mm-hmm.
And so once you kind of graduate from that first 3 months, we're obviously still meeting on a weekly basis, but we feel like at that point we've had time to have you check the boxes on almost all of the main things that we're looking for.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And I know that we're getting close-ish to the end of the session. So I want to reiterate that people are allowed to ask questions or comment if they want to. While I'm giving space for that, I do have a question for you. What would you say to the people who are telling themselves right now, I'm a great manager, I'm a great coach? And would you say, yeah, you probably are? I mean, how would you challenge someone who already thinks that they're great at being a manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good coach is going to be someone who is open to feedback. So, in my one-on-ones every week, one of the line items, the last question on the agenda is, how can I be a better manager for you? What do you need from me? And if consistently I'm getting reps say nothing, you're doing great. I kind of poke and prod a little bit more and just say, seriously, come on, like,
yeah,
surely there's something I can do to better help you. So I would just say get comfortable with like trying to ask for that feedback and, ask it from kind of that 360 view all around you, just to understand like how you're doing. And I think you can also just get a good glimpse of that based on the engagement of your employees. Like, how are they responding when you have tough conversations with them? How are they responding when you're asking more from them?
Yeah.
Right? Are they like, disengaging and like, oh my gosh, like I've got to do more of this, or are they like excited? And, I think that'll give you a glimpse into, how well you're doing as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think what I'm hearing is just the importance of reading body language, which means right now, virtually, you really need to set up those actual Zoom video calls and not just rely on a phone call. Because I think body language is super, super important when you're trying to understand how your employees feel, but also if you're trying to be a better manager and coach. Here is a question. I'll read it out loud. How can you encourage people to ask for help given being remote? There just seems to be a bigger barrier since you can't just casually speak up like in an office setting.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. A couple things come to mind. If you are sensing something, I think I said it earlier, but I've had to do this a couple times in the last few weeks where I think there's an issue and they don't want to ask a question. So I'll just directly like ask them. I say, I'm feeling like you are struggling in this area, or you may have a question around this, like, am I way off or are you good in that area? That's one thing. Another thing that I've done before is actually, there's a number of different services you can use and they're actually free. One's called Office Vibe. And basically it's just like surveys that you can send out to your team, and they can have anonymous responses. So they don't have to have any anxiety around like asking that question. And so that's another thing I would do is like send out a weekly poll to the team on whatever, kind of main areas that you want to observe or survey, to try to get some of that anonymous feedback as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to type that in the chat. What's it called?
Office Vibe.
Officevibe.com, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Cool. That's a great tool.
Yep.
And then with that, to piggyback on that, I think it's also, it goes beyond that. I think it's important to cultivate a culture of kind of openness. I don't like to use the word transparency because transparency can mean so many different things for so many different companies. But I think openness means enabling and empowering people to ask questions and to voice concerns, whether that's through a monthly engagement survey or whether it's the Q&A portion or the AMA portion of all hands meetings or town halls. Being okay with that is really important, and that comes from leadership. So hopefully leadership is kind of doing those things. They're setting that example. I think also, and then when you kind of look at it at a more micro level as a manager, I'm not one, but to me, as someone who is managed by someone, I love communication. Err on the side of over communication. I mean, especially if you're not getting it from leadership, if you're not getting it from your department lead, at least as a manager, as a coach, you can control how you communicate and when you communicate to your team, right? And so even though we're virtual, obviously these Zoom or Ring Central or GoTo meetings, Google Hangouts, utilize those platforms, create that face-to-face time and over communicate with your team. Because that's what I would want. I think most people would rather feel like they're in the know than not, especially during these times. And just because we're virtual doesn't mean we can't communicate. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, no, that's on point. I mean, over communication right now is super important.
Yeah. And you can control that as a manager.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily control when your boss or when the CEO communicates, but you can to your team. All right. Looks like there aren't any other questions, and I definitely like to honor the time that we set for these things. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. Thank you so much for your knowledge and your experience sharing. And like I said at the very beginning, I will email a survey out. I'll email the recording too. Please share it as you need, reference back to it. And that is all I have for everybody. So thanks again.